how did you started writing this story? What were those factors? What were those pushing points where you decided to cover this story?
I think the point of writing this piece was to try to explore a phenomenon I noticed over the past few years with regards to terrorist attacks internationally, where we increasingly saw that Indian and Central Asian fighters in particular were appearing outside their borders. Now, this may seem a sort of obvious point, but actually it's quite new. If you look at sort of jihadist terrorism internationally, outside of their sort of immediate countries, so in the case of Indians, India, and Central Asia, the sort of Central Asian region, you haven't actually seen that many attacks internationally involving individuals from these two communities. And my point was to try to dig into understanding why that was happening. And in fact, the attack that we saw earlier this year in Jalalabad in Afghanistan provided a quite useful hook to really focus this, because in that attack we saw individuals involved in the attack who were Indian, who were Tajik, and who were Pakistani, and who were Afghan. But the inclusion of Indians and Tajiks in particular was what struck me.
All right. So can you let us know that what were the challenges, what were those obstacles that you covered while covering this story, or it was like so easy doing this?
Well, I mean, it was really a question of trying to dig up the information. I mean, when you're trying to look at some of these questions, understanding, where attackers are actually from is actually quite complicated. So in some ways, the complexity was trying to dig into really understanding exactly where it was that these people were from. It was also quite difficult to piece together exactly whether we had seen Central Asians or Indians involved in attacks before. And after doing a lot of digging, I kind of uncovered that there really hadn't been. And Indians in particular was the kind of novel one, because Indians, we really haven't seen many Indians involved in international terrorist attacks under the jihadi banner, notwithstanding the fact you have got such a large Muslim population within India, and notwithstanding the fact that you have got all sorts of issues within that country which would feed their grievances. So trying to understand some of those trends and understand whether we'd seen these before or whether this was new was quite a sort of complicated picture to piece together.
And can you please expand on the role of the movements that you've mentioned in your news that we have seen, like the Islamic movement of Uzbekistan, Jundul Khalifa, Islamic Jihadi Union? What exactly were their roles and what they were doing? What were those points where they played their part in creating the turbulence in this region?
Well, I think when you're looking at the Central Asian groups in particular, what's fascinating about them is the limited amount of activity they've actually tried to do in Central Asia. So all the groups that you listed are ones which have a link to sort of the Central Asian communities, and they've been active for some time. But when you look at what they've actually done, it's actually it's not much. They fought in Afghanistan, they fought in Pakistan, rather than doing anything outside their areas, which kind of goes against the grain of the kind of vision of international jihadist movements, which see themselves as international organizations that are really trying to transform the world. Ultimately, these groups seem to stay quite locked into sort of local parochial struggles. And so their agency within this is quite interesting, because it suggests that, these groups, while they talk this narrative of being international, are in fact really quite regional and local. And this is the element that I think ISIS has injected, or the Islamic State, or Daesh, or what do you want to call them, has injected into the picture, which is it's transformed the sort of the willingness of Central Asians in particular, amongst many other communities, to really see themselves as part of a global struggle, which previously what you tended to see was kind of the international jihadist movement essentially latching on to local issues in different areas and expressing itself really as part of a kind of local conflict. I think what we saw in Islamic State was really globalize this whole narrative and really push the borders of where people would see their struggles actually being, whereas previously it really was a kind of much more local sort of activity.
Right. So, Mr. Raffaello, can you help us expand on this point where you've seen, the world has seen, we all have witnessed that Pakistan has paid a huge amount, economic, huge amount of, lives against the war on terror. Do you think India played a vital role in fueling the fire in this region and doing insurgencies from the provinces like Balochistan?
I mean, I think that, it's a very, very complicated picture in South Asia when we look at sort of militant groups and terrorist groups and how they're linked and connected. I don't think anyone would deny that Pakistan has suffered a great deal in the sort of global war on terror. domestically, most of all. I mean, certainly it's a country that suffered all sorts of terrorist atrocities that still continue, unfortunately, to this day. And some of those are linked to international groups. Some of them are linked to groups that may be being stirred by neighbors across the border in India or elsewhere. But I think we must always remember that when we're looking to some of these groups, they usually have a local reason and local grievance that starts their problem. So when we look at the problems in Balochistan, it is possible. It's very difficult to find definitive evidence that there are people in other countries who are potentially stirring them up. But I think you can't look away from the fact that the people in Balochistan are not happy. And so the reason that grievance exists in the first place provides something that others can in some cases manipulate. But I don't think we should take away from the fact that there are some problems that still exist there. And I think that's always the problem when we look at sort of terrorist
Right, Mr. Raffaello.
Attacks and terrorist violence around the world. Ultimately, yes.
My question is, why international community could not play the role that was expected to act against India, to play their contribution against whatever the India has been doing since long, like your story is an evidence to what has happened there. Pakistan, the Prime Minister of Pakistan, the intelligence agencies of Pakistan, wherever it is possible, Pakistan has raised this voice as India is fueling hatred, is fueling a lot of oppression, aggression in this region, including Kashmir. So why international community is not taking those measures what do you think why they're not doing it? The measures the international community should have taken against India. Why they're reluctant on that? What are the reasons?
Well, I think you'll see, I think there is a lot of condemnation you'll see from governments towards what India is doing. And I think there is this high degree of concern in some capitals, not in all capitals, about how India is treating some of its minority communities at home. So I think that is something that does come under a lot of sort of condemnation. But it's very difficult to get any country to sort of change its behavior towards its own people. And I think that's the problem that we hit up against with India, but also with other countries. If you look at China, for example, what China has been doing in terms of its treatment of its minority populations, that's caused all sorts of uproar internationally, but ultimately it's very difficult. There's a lot of condemnation around this, but I think there are also the hard realities of geopolitics that ultimately tend to...
Right. Thank you very much. That was Mr. Raffaello.